Welcome to the CDA Institute's Geopolitical Update. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the Institute, and I'm joined by geopolitical expert Joseph Varner, Deputy Director of the Conference of Defense Associations and former Director of Policy for the Minister of National Defense. In this podcast, Joe will provide his analysis and insights on the most significant geopolitical and international security developments of the week. So grab your headphones and get ready for a concise but comprehensive update on the world's most pressing geopolitical issues. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. Joe, great to be with you again for the Geopolitical Update. Can you provide our listeners with a brief overview of what's been happening on the global stage this week? What are the key highlights and trends that we should be aware of before we get into more specifics?
So, Josh, three stories this week that are of particular interest are President Biden's withdrawal from the upcoming presidential campaign, Iran's nuclear program, and what I'll call the shipping news.
Awesome, Joe. Why don't we start by discussing what I think is probably the biggest story of the past few weeks, President Joe Biden's withdrawal from the 2024 election campaign.
This week's surprise revelation that President Biden was withdrawing from the upcoming presidential election campaign in the United States has kind of led to a lot of questions about President Biden's mental state and fitness to serve out his term. And even though it's just a few months, his fitness is still a major issue. The Republicans, for their part, immediately came out and suggested that if President Biden was not fit to run for president, then he was probably not fit actually to continue serving as president. For the United States and its allies, this could not be a more serious debate that's unfolding in the United States, the linchpin leader of the free world. As we warned previously, there can be little doubt that Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are watching events in Washington with great interest and may be looking to take advantage of what they now likely see as a very weak, lame duck president who may have mental issues in terms of his mental health and his stability as a leader. And of course, the United States is in an election period now, kind of full swing. And his vice president's now out on the campaign hustings. So he's kind of deprived of his vice president in a sense on a daily basis. So it's important to remember that Russia is currently involved in a hybrid warfare offensive against European NATO states. And they may well move that to a campaign to North America with the instability of the United States. Does U.S. instability in its political leadership aid China in subduing Taiwan or taking some territory in the Indo-Pacific? Does Iran build a nuclear bomb, and does North Korea threaten war with the South or carry out another hostile act? And how credible is the U.S. nuclear guarantee right now with Biden in office? And all those questions are swirling out there in the international community and among the U.S. and its allies. And so it's a pretty serious concern right now about what's going on in the United States, and in particular what's going on in the Democratic Party.
Thanks, Joe. Perhaps probably one of the most significant or interesting periods of U.S. politics, at least in my short lifetime. Why don't we move on to our next topic, an update on Iran's nuclear program?
So not surprisingly, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave a warning in Washington, D.C. On Wednesday in his speech that when Israel stops Iran's nuclear weapons program, it's not just protecting Israel, it's protecting the United States as well. And this follows U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's comments at the Aspen Security Forum that Iran can now produce the necessary fissile material for an atomic bomb in as little as a week or two, but that is yet to take steps to assemble a weapon. And given that Iran has provided material assistance to Russia for its war in Ukraine and heavily supported by North Korea, it's almost certain now that Iran has the technology to make an effective nuclear weapon, and in fact probably has the warhead technology or can access it from its friends to mount a nuclear weapon on a missile. So we've kind of reached the tipping point in terms of Iran's nuclear program. And it was reported on the weekend that Iranian nuclear scientists were running simulations on nuclear weapons under the guise of an academic study, but in reality, almost every analyst knew that the academic exercise has now moved well beyond what would be considered an academic research project, and is in fact a study of how to make nuclear weapons. Um, and like I said, they're heavily likely aided by Russia and North Korea. You'll remember in mid-June, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reestablished the working groups made up of members of Israel's defense establishment, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Israel's intelligence community to focus on Iran's nuclear program. And Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, said in June that the West could not stop Iran from building a nuclear weapon if Tehran wanted to pursue such a program. We now seem to be walking with destiny with Iran a week or 2 weeks out from having the material it needs to create a nuclear weapon. And Iranian nuclear weapon will have consequences for the entire region and will put enormous pressure on Israel to carry out a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities.
Well, thanks, Joe. We've been discussing Iran a lot and the conflict with Israel in the region over the past few podcasts. So it'll be interesting to see what updates you have for us next week. Why don't we move on to our last big ticket story of the day? Russian destroyers and submarines in the Baltic Sea. You called it your shipping story. So maybe you can explain what's happening in this region of the world.
So it's a curious bit of what I would call shipping news, and it comes in a couple parts. But all that to say, early this week, a Russian nuclear-powered submarine, the Tambov, and a destroyer and landing vessel came into the Baltic to be there for Russian Navy Day on the 28th of July. And they came from the Northern Fleet. And then all of a sudden, without any sort of notice or fanfare, they turned around and sailed out of the Baltic and sailed back to the Northern Fleet without any sort of explanation. In fact, the submarine sailed on the surface, which was also curious as it left the Baltic. Usually it would, be submerged, but it seemed to do the sail right out of the Baltic, almost like it was under escort. And the group of ships sailed back for the Northern Fleet. Why these ships returned abruptly to the Northern Fleet remains an open-ended question. In fact, given the importance Russia places on Navy Day, and particularly in St. Petersburg, President Putin's hometown, the departure is kind of bizarre. And it's interesting to note that a Type 52 guided missile destroyer from China arrived to take part in the Navy Day celebrations in St. Petersburg. So it's not because the day is being scaled down.
Thanks, Joe. Before we close out this week's episode, what are some other stories we should be watching in the coming days or weeks?
NORAD detected and intercepted 2 Russian Bear bombers and 2 Chinese Badgers. These are nuclear-capable strategic bombers that were flying in formation and moved into the Alaska Air Defense Identification Zone. NORAD fighters from both the United States and Canada were dispatched to conduct the intercept, and they escorted the Chinese and Russian aircraft out of the Alaska ADIZ. But it's important to note that we're starting to see Russia and China jointly in patrols in proximity to North America, particularly in proximity to Alaska, with both nuclear-capable ships and nuclear-capable aircraft. And it's only a few weeks ago that we saw Chinese and Russian naval vessels, warships in close proximity to the Aleutian Islands in formation, operating jointly. And we're seeing fears now in the United States in terms of its new Arctic strategy, and in the West in general, about what China is getting from Russia in return for its material support during the Ukraine war, and if that extends to the Arctic realm between the two, and whether Russia is going to give China the keys to the Arctic, is a big open-ended concern at the moment. And of course, Canada's Arctic is essentially the Achilles heel of North America and NATO's northern flank. So it's a matter of watching events over the next few years and preparing for an increase of Russian and Chinese presence in our Arctic.
Well, thanks, Joe. And I'd like to let listeners know that later this week, we will be putting out a joint podcast with the Canadian Naval Association on our naval capabilities and Arctic security. And in the coming weeks, we'll be putting out some more content on Arctic security. So stay tuned for that. Joe, thank you once again for your insightful analysis and for guiding us through this week's geopolitical developments. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in once again. Be sure to check us out next week as we reconvene with Joe to delve into another week of global affairs. Thank you, everyone.